To Donald Trump's new team right now, the new cabinet is beginning to take shape. With more high-profile appointments, the president-elect is poised to pick two men with track records of harshly criticising China for key positions in his new administration. Senator Marco Rubio is expected to be named Secretary of State, while Representative Mike Waltz is in line to be National Security Advisor. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta right now, anchor of the opening trade, for the details. One name more familiar, I would argue, to international viewers than the other. Marco Rubio, fairly familiar. The importance of this role, Secretary of State, hugely important cabinet position. What do we know about what it signals around China-U.S. relations?
Well, Marco Rubio, from an internal domestic perspective, has been not only outspoken about China and some of the other international players. Russia, of course, has been one. Iran has been another that he's been outspoken about. But he's internally kind of known as the connection of the Republican Party to the Latino vote. And this is really important because he, of course, hails from Florida, where there is a major Cuban population, not to mention broader Hispanic population as well. The reason this is significant is because when he was initially, remember, he did have his own run for president, when he was initially brought in to work with President Trump and kind of allied in that way, it was initially to tackle the domestic story, things like the border, things like immigration. Now he's talking about that China policy, and it's the fact that he's actually been sanctioned by Beijing is probably not the strongest start as a Secretary of State. Again, this comes off after years of very harsh comments, but it is something that you can see really creates and kind of amps up this anti-China rhetoric.
Yeah, indeed. And China will have to work out a solution if Marco Rubio is ever going to visit China, given that he is sanctioned by that country. A redhead crossing the terminal right now from CNN reporting that Trump has picked Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary. So some more details coming through for the team. Again, Kristi Noem being picked as Homeland Security Secretary, according to CNN, for this new Trump administration. Talk us through a name that, again, I think would be less familiar to an international audience, which is Mike Waltz. What he stands for, what he brings to this team.
Well, it's a similar story in that he is also very, very tough on China. You are seeing very carefully that the people that are being picked for these cabinet positions have that stance. And it's not just Mike Waltz. I'll come back to him in a moment. It's also the new UN ambassador as well. She's a senator from New York, from the House, from the Republicans. She was a House of Representative. Her name's Elise, and it's very, very important to keep this in mind, simply because he is picking the folks that have been, one, early supporters, especially at a time when a lot of people were criticizing him, of course, for January 6th, his role there as well in those Capitol riots as well. The fact that he's, one, leaning into his loyalty base, but also, two, that are very, very tough on China. And that's where Mike Waltz, that chosen pick, is so important, because he has historically been very, very tough on China in a way that I would argue that even Marco Rubio hasn't gone to. As a national security advisor, that brings into questions things like defense to Taiwan, funding to kind of other South Asian countries as well. Remember, Japan, South Korea at the moment are trying to get more of that Pacific funding. At the meantime, the Pacific wing of the U.S. Defense Department, for example, is extremely underfunded, and this is something nobody within Washington is really talking about as much as a threat, the focus largely being on the Middle East and Ukraine as well. Mike Waltz could change that narrative.